Welcome to the channel Stories of Slavery. Today's story tells of an enslaved boy on a plantation who was bitten by a snake, ignored, and left behind to die. But 10 hours later, something happened that no one could explain, something unbelievable and never meant to be spoken of again. This is a heavy and emotional story, so pause for a moment, take a breath, and listen closely. Before we start, please subscribe and tell me in the comments which city and country you are listening from. Your involvement helps make sure these stories are remembered instead of forgotten. Let us begin. The sun had not fully risen when a scream ripped through the quiet of Meadowbrook Plantation in Wilkinson County, Mississippi, in July of 1851. It was a sharp, desperate cry coming from the cotton fields that stretched like a white ocean as far as the eye could see. The sound traveled across the 1,200 acres of worked land, past the slave cabins, past the overseer's house, and reached the big house where the Hartwick family still slept in their soft feather beds. Thomas, a boy only 10 years old, had just felt the most painful bite of his short life. The water moccasin, known scientifically as Agistrodon piscivorus, was more than 3 feet long. Its hemotoxic venom had already begun spreading through the boy's small, thin body. The snake had been curled beneath a fallen cotton plant, hidden in the early morning shadows. Thomas had bent down to clear trash from his row when he felt the strike. 2 fangs, each about a 1/4 inch long, pierced the thin cloth of his worn pants and sank deep into the flesh of his left calf. Thomas collapsed to his knees among the cotton plants, grabbing his leg where 2 red marks were swelling fast. The pain was unlike anything he had ever felt in his 10 years. It felt as if hot metal spikes had been driven into his leg, followed by burning oil poured straight into the wounds. Tears streamed down his dust-covered face as he tried to scream again, but his voice came out weak, barely more than a whisper. His throat was dry from shock and fear. The other enslaved workers nearby heard the scream and stopped picking. They knew that sound. It was the sound of sudden and terrible pain. Old Jacob, who had worked those fields for 53 years, knew it right away. He had heard it before, when Daniel lost his hand in the cotton gin 5 years earlier, when Sarah's youngest child fell into the fire pit, and when Moses took a beating that broke 3 ribs. Still, no one moved toward Thomas. They could not without permission. The rules on Meadowbrook Plantation were strict and cruel. You did not leave your assigned row. You did not stop working unless ordered. You did not help another enslaved person without direct permission from the overseer or field boss. Breaking these rules meant punishment. A whipping if you were lucky, something far worse if you were not. So they stood frozen in place, watching the small boy twist in pain 50 yards away. Their hands stayed wrapped around their cotton sacks, their faces forced into blank masks, even as their hearts broke. Every one of them knew what it meant when a child screamed like that in the fields. It meant something terrible had happened, and terrible things in the fields often meant death. Samuel Hartwick, the plantation overseer, arrived on his brown horse just 3 minutes after the scream. He'd been making his morning rounds, checking irrigation ditches on the Nort. Age 40, when he heard the noise. Hartwick was 42 years old, tall and thin, with a thick mustache and pale blue eyes that showed no warmth or care. He had worked as an overseer for 20 years on plantations across Mississippi and Louisiana. He was known equally for being efficient and cruel. He dismounted slowly and walked toward Thomas, who lay curled on his side between the cotton rows. His boots crunched against the dry soil. The morning dew had already vanished in the July heat. The temperature was rising fast, and by noon it would climb past 95 degrees. Hartwick looked down at the boy without any emotion. He had seen this before. Snake bites were common on plantations. The fields were full of cottonmouths, copperheads, and rattlesnakes. Every summer, 2 or 3 enslaved people were bitten. Some lived, most did not. The overseer spat tobacco juice onto the ground near Thomas's head and folded his arms. He studied the boy with the same cold interest he might gee to a broken plow or a lame mule. To Hartwick, Thomas was an investment. Samuel Hartwick Sr., the plantation owner, had paid $300 for Thomas's mother 8 years earlier when she was pregnant. That made Thomas property of the estate, valued in the ledger at about $250 based on his age and condition. But $250 was not worth the cost of medical care, at least not by Hartwick's thinking. Thomas managed to look up through tears of pain. His young face was twisted with fear and agony. His leg had swollen to almost twice its normal size. The skin was stretched tight and shiny. The bite marks were clear, 2 puncture wounds about half an inch apart, surrounded by a growing ring of dark purple and black skin. Hartwick nudged the boy's leg with his boot. Thomas screamed. The other enslaved workers flinched but kept their eyes down and their hands moving through the cotton. To look too closely might draw Hartwick's attention, and his attention was never a good thing. The overseer pulled a pocket watch from his vest and checked the time. It was 6:45 in the morning. The doctor in Woodville was 3 hours away by horse. A house visit would cost $5, plus the cost of treatment. Medicine for a snakebite would add another $2 or $3. The doctor would need food and a place to stay while watching the patient. Altogether, saving the boy would cost between $10 and $15. Hartwick did the math quickly. $15 in expenses for a $250 asset. On paper, saving the boy might seem reasonable, but Hartwick also knew the odds. Water moccasin bites killed about 30% of adults who received proper treatment. For children, especially underfed enslaved children, the death rate was closer to 60%, even with care. Without treatment, Thomas would almost certainly die. Hartwick made his choice with the cold logic of a man who saw people as property. The boy was not worth the risk. Better to accept the loss now than spend money and still lose him. He turned and walked back toward his horse without saying another word to Thomas. When he reached the animal, he called out loudly so all nearby workers could hear. The words were short and final. The boy would receive no help, no doctor, no medicine, not even water. Nature would decide his fate. If the child was strong enough to live, he would live. If not, that was simply how things were. Hartwick mounted his horse and rode away toward the main house, leaving Thomas alone in the dirt between the cotton rows. The other enslaved workers watched him go. Then, one by one, they returned to their labor. Their hands moved without thought, pulling cotton bolls and stuffing them into long sacks tied around their waists. But their minds stayed with the small boy dying in the field. Sarah, a woman of 38 who had given birth to 6 children and buried 4 of them, felt tears running down her face as she worked. She made no sound and did not wipe them away. She simply let them fall while her hands kept moving. She had learned long ago that crying did not stop the work. The body could keep going even while the heart shattered. Moses, a strong man of 42 who could pick 400 pounds of cotton in a single day, clenched his jaw until his teeth ached. He wanted to run to the boy. He wanted to lift him and carry him to safety. He wanted to ride to Woodville himself and bring back the doctor. But he did none of those things. He picked cotton and hated himself for it. Old Jacob, who had seen more death than any man ever should, slowly shook his head and whispered a prayer. He prayed the boy would not suffer long. He prayed the pain would end quickly. He prayed that God would show mercy to a child who had known nothing but hardship. Thomas remained where he had fallen. The sun climbed higher, and the heat grew worse. July in Mississippi showed no mercy. The heat pressed down like a heavy weight. The air shimmered above the cotton fields, and not a single breeze moved the leaves. The boy drifted in and out of awareness as the venom worked its way through his body. Water moccasin venom destroys blood cells and tissue. It contains enzymes that break down cell walls, causing cells to burst and die. It also prevents blood from clotting, leading to internal bleeding. In Thomas's leg, the flesh around the bite was already dying, a process known as necrosis. The cells were being starved of oxygen as the venom destroyed the blood vessels that fed them. His skin darkened from red to purple to black as the damage spread. Swelling increased as fluid leaked into nearby tissue. The venom moved through his bloodstream, carried by his heart to every part of his body. His kidneys began to fail as they tried to filter the poison. His liver was damaged, his blood pressure dropped, and his heartbeat became uneven. By every medical rule of the time, Thomas Schul, D. have been dead within 4 hours. A child his size, bitten by a snake that large, with venom driven deep into muscle, had almost no chance of survival without immediate care. But Thomas did not die after 4 hours. He did not die after 6 hours either. Something kept him alive. Whether it was chance, strong blood, or something beyond explanation, no one could say. But his heart continued to beat. His lungs kept breathing. His chest rose and fell, slow and uneven, like he was struggling just to pull air inside. His body was still trying to hold on. 2 hours after the bite, Thomas went completely still. His breathing became so faint it could barely be seen. The swelling had climbed from his leg up to his hip. The flesh around the bite had turned fully black. Flies began to circle, drawn by the smell of dying meat. The field hands were moved farther away. Hartwick did not want them looking at the boy. He wanted his cotton gathered. The plantation ran on hard rules. Every grown slave had to pick at least 200 pounds a day during the busy season. Children were expected to pick based on their size and age. Failing to meet quota meant less food or punishment. So the slaves kept working, and Thomas lay alone, dying beneath the harsh Mississippi sun. But someone had been watching the whole time. Ruth was the head cook at the big house. She was 53 years old, nearly 6 feet tall, with wide shoulders and strong hands. She'd worked on Meadowbrook plantation since she was 7. She arrived in a wagon with her mother and 2 brothers after being sold at auction in Natchez. Her mother died of cholera when Ruth was 12. Her brothers were sold to different plantations when she was 15. She never saw them again. Ruth survived by being useful. She learned to cook from the former head cook, an elderly woman named Grace, who taught her how to prepare meals for white families. Ruth learned which cuts of meat the Hartwicks liked, how they wanted their eggs cooked, how hot they expected their coffee. She learned how to stay unseen while still being necessary. She learned to know what was needed before anyone asked. She learned never to complain, never to argue, never to show feeling. But Ruth also learned things Grace never taught her. Knowledge passed down from her grandmother, who had been born in Africa and brought across the ocean in chains. Knowledge of roots, leaves, and healing. Quiet wisdom that white doctors never learned in their fine schools back east. Ruth's grandmother had been what people called a root woman, a conjure woman. She knew which plants lowered fever, which stopped bleeding, which eased pain. She knew how to set bones, deliver babies, treat burns, cuts, and infection. She taught this knowledge to Ruth's mother, who passed it on to Ruth before dying in terrible pain, her stomach destroyed by cholera. Ruth used this knowledge in silence. When a slave fell ill, she slipped herbs into their food. When a child had colic, she brewed a tea to calm the belly. When someone was beaten badly, she applied poultices to reduce swelling and stop infection. She did all of it carefully and in secret. White people did not allow slaves to practice medicine. They called it witchcraft or voodoo and punished anyone caught. But Ruth could not stop. It was the only power she had in a life without power. The only way she could push back against the suffering she saw every day. Ruth had been carrying water to the field workers when she heard Thomas scream. She saw Hartwick ride up and then leave. She watched as the other slaves were forced to walk away from the boy, and she made a choice. She would wait. Waiting was something Ruth had learned over 46 years of slavery. You did not act right away. You watched. You waited for the right moment. You planned carefully, because mistakes meant death. Hartwick had ridden back to the main house for breakfast. The field boss, a poor white man named Jenkins, hired cheap Bicot. Say he stayed half drunk most of the time, was watching workers on the far end of the land. The other white men were in town getting supplies. This was her chance. Ruth set down the water bucket and walked straight toward where Thomas lay. She moved with purpose, not rush. Anyone watching would think she was only doing her duty, checking the situation, preparing to remove a body. When she reached Thomas, she dropped to her knees beside him. She touched his forehead with the back of her hand. His skin burned. His pulse, faint in his thin neck, was weak and uneven. Thread-like, doctors would say, ready to snap at any second. His leg was awful. The swelling ran from his foot to his groin. The skin was dark purple and black. The flesh around the bite marks was completely dead. If it stayed, it would rot. Clear fluid mixed with blood leaked from the puncture wounds. Ruth had seen snake bites before. She had treated them using her grandmother's ways. Some lived, some died. But she had never say. And one this bad. And never on a child this young who had been left alone for so long. She judged quickly. The boy might have 6 hours left, maybe less. His body was failing. The venom had spread too far. There was too much damage, too much bleeding inside. No amount of herbs or poultices could undo what had already happened. But Ruth had learned something else, something white doctors did not understand. The body wanted to live. Give it even a small chance, the tiniest help, and it would fight. Ruth looked around fast. She had maybe 10 minutes before someone noticed she was gone. 10 minutes to save a life, or at least try. She stood and ran. Her long skirt snagged on cotton plants as she crossed the field toward the tree line where the farm met the wild woods. She was too old for this running. Her knees ached, her back burned, but a child was dying, and that pushed her harder than she had moved in years. Ruth knew exactly what she needed. The edge of the forest held plants that had grown wild in Mississippi for thousands of years. Plants used by native people long before white men came. Plants Ruth's grandmother taught her to find. Plantain was first, not the fruit rich people ate, but the common weed with wide green leaves. Plantago major, scientists called it. Its leaves reduced swelling and pulled poison from wounds. Native people had used it for snake bites for generations. Ruth tore up handfuls of leaves. Next was white oak. The bark held tannins that strengthened blood vessels and slowed bleeding. She used a stone to peel bark from a fallen branch and stuffed it into her apron. Then witch hazel, growing near the creek along the eastern edge of the plantation. Ruth ran there, breath tearing from her chest. The heat pressed down on her. Sweat soaked her clothes, but she did not stop. She snapped off branches with leaves still attached. Witch hazel reduced swelling and bleeding. White doctors had only recently begun using it. Ruth's grandmother had known it before. Last was wild garlic. It grew in clumps near the water. Ruth pulled up 3 plants, roots and all. Garlic kept blood moving, not too thick, not too thin. Science would later explain it. Ruth only knew it worked. She ran back to the field. 7 minutes gone. Thomas had not moved. His lips were turning blue. His breathing was barely there. Ruth dropped beside him and worked fast, steady, sure. First, a plantain. She put the leaves in her mouth and chewed them until they became pulp. The taste was bitter and green. Saliva helped break the plant down, made it ready to work. She spat the paste into her hand and pressed it onto the bite, forcing it into the puncture wounds and spreading it over the dead flesh. She tore a strip from her own underskirt and wrapped his leg. Not tight enough to stop blood, but tight enough to hold the poultice and slow the venom. Next came the garlic. She crushed the bulbs with a rock. The smell was sharp and strong. She rubbed it onto Thomas's chest over his heart. Her grandmother said it helped the heart keep beating, helped the blood keep moving. But the boy needed water. Badly. The venom, the heat, and hours in the sun had drained him dry. Dehydration would kill him even if the poison did not. Ruth pulled out a small clay bottle from her apron. She always carried it, filled with water and herbs. Today it held white oak bark tea, brewed the night before. Bitter, but healing. She lifted Thomas's head carefully. It rolled to the side. His eyes stayed shut. For one terrible second, Ruth thought she had lost him. Then she felt the faint pulse again, felt the weak breath brush her skin. Ruth tilted. She tilted the bottle and let small drops of the oak bark tea slide into Thomas's mouth. At first, there was no change at all. His throat would not respond. The liquid pooled inside his mouth and slowly leaked out from the sides of his lips. Still, Ruth did not stop. She kept going. She rubbed his throat softly with her fingers, trying to trigger the swallowing reflex. She leaned close and spoke to him in a quiet, steady voice, offering gentle encouragement. She knew he likely could not hear her, but she spoke anyway. After a moment, she felt a slight movement beneath her fingers. His throat worked. He swallowed once. It was weak and automatic, not something he chose to do, but it was real. Ruth gave him more of the tea. He swallowed again, then once more. She managed to get maybe 2 spoonfuls into him before his throat stopped responding. It was not much, but it was better than nothing at all. Ruth stayed beside Thomas for another 3 minutes, watching his chest lift and fall with shallow, strained breaths. She checked his pulse again. It was still thin and weak, but perhaps, just perhaps, it felt a little stronger than before, or maybe she only wanted it to be. She had done all she could for the moment. If she stayed longer, someone would notice she was gone. Jenkins might wake from his nap. Hartwick might back to inspect the fields. Another slave might mention seeing her away from her duties, trying to please the white folks. Ruth pushed herself to her feet slowly, her knees aching. She looked down at Thomas one last time. The boy looked close to death. His skin was gray, his leg horribly damaged, but his heart was still beating. She lifted her water buckets and walked back toward the big house as if nothing had happened. She forced her face into a blank expression. Her steps were calm and even. She faded back into the background. The other slaves had seen everything. They saw Ruth run to the woods and return. They saw her kneel beside Thomas and tend to him. They saw her give him something to drink. They understood what she had done and why. Not one of them would speak of it. Not to the white people, not ever. As Ruth passed Sarah's row, their eyes met briefly. Sarah gave a tiny nod, almost too small to notice, a silent sign of understanding. Ruth nodded back. 6 hours after the snakebite, Thomas was still alive. From a medical standpoint, this was astonishing. Most children his size would have died within 3 to 4 hours from a water moccasin bite that severe without treatment. In the mid-19th century, the death rate for untreated water moccasin bites in children was around 80%. Yet something was working, whether it was Ruth's plant remedies, or Thomas's own body fighting harder than expected, or simple luck, no one could say. But his heart kept beating, his lungs kept pulling in air, his body kept resisting death. The sun began to sink toward the west. The temperature dropped from 98 degrees to a slightly more tolerable 88. The worst heat of the day passed. Shadows stretched long across the cotton fields. Ruth returned to check on Thomas as the workers prepared to end their long day. During cotton season, the slaves worked from sunrise to sunset, usually 14 to 16 hours. When the sun dipped low, Jenkins, old blow a horn to signal the end of work. The slaves would carry their cotton sacks to be weighed and recorded, then drag themselves back to their cabins for their evening food. Ruth carried a bowl covered with cloth. Anyone watching would assume she was bringing evening rations, a normal task for her. No one questioned it. Hartwick had gone into town hours earlier. Jenkins was asleep under his favorite tree, an empty whiskey bottle beside him. No one was paying attention. Ruth knelt beside Thomas again and carefully removed the plantain poultice. What she saw made her stop breathing for a moment. The poultice had drawn out a large amount of fluid. The cloth was soaked with clear liquid, blood, and a yellowish substance that could have been pus or venom. The leaves were dark, slimy, and broken down. More importantly, the dead tissue around the bite had not spread. The blackened flesh was still there, ugly and frightening, but it had not grown. The border between living and dead tissue was clear. That was a very good sign. It meant the damage had stopped spreading. Ruth removed the old poultice and examined the wound closely. The swelling had gone down a little. Not a lot, but enough to notice. The leg was still badly swollen and discolored, but less so than 6 hours earlier. She prepared a fresh poultice, mixing crushed plantain leaves with witch hazel. The witch hazel would help calm the swelling. She wrapped the leg carefully with clean cloth. Then she tried to give Thomas more liquid. This time she had brought a thin broth made from chicken bones and wild herbs. It had salt and small amounts of protein and fat that his body desperately needed. This time Thomas reacted better. When the liquid touched his lips, his throat moved on its own. He swallowed without help. His eyelids fluttered. For a brief moment his eyes opened. They were unfocused, cloudy, and uneven. He looked at Ruth but did not truly see her. There was no recognition. Then his eyes closed again and his body went still. But in that moment, Ruth knew he would live. Against every expectation, Thomas was going to survive. In that same moment, an idea formed in her mind. It was risky and desperate, but it could be brilliant. It would require careful planning and perfect timing. If it failed, it could mean death for everyone involved. If it worked, it could mean freedom for Thomas. Ruth stayed until full darkness, leaving only when she had to return to the big house to prepare the evening meal. As she stood to go, old Jacob approached quietly. Their words were soft and quick. Jacob had seen everything. He knew the boy should be dead. He knew Ruth was planning something, and he wanted to help. Ruth told him to gather Moses and Sarah. They would meet before dawn in the woods, in the clearing the white people believed was haunted. They would talk. They would plan. They would take a terrible risk. Hartwick had left Thomas to die. To the overseer, the boy was already gone. No one had checked on him all day except Ruth. No one cared if he lived or died. And if everyone already believed Thomas was dead, then maybe they could make him disappear. Thomas survive. The night. When Ruth checked on him before dawn, moving silently through the cotton field without a lantern, she saw a dramatic change. The fever that had burned through him had broken. His forehead was cool and damp instead of dry and burning. His breathing was stronger and more regular. His pulse, though still weak, was steady. Most surprising of all, the swelling in his leg had gone down by nearly half. The tissue was still damaged, but the death of the flesh had stopped completely. Ruth allowed herself one brief moment of relief. Then she remembered what came next, and the relief turned into tension. The most dangerous part was about to begin. She moved through the dark woods to the meeting place. The clearing was small, surrounded by thick pine and oak trees that blocked most light. Spanish moss hung from the branches like gray curtains. The white workers believed the place was haunted by the ghost of a slave woman who had died there years ago. They stayed far away. The slaves knew the truth. The woman had been killed, not by her own hand, but by an overseer for learning to read. Her name was Elizabeth. She had taught many children their letters in secret. The clearing was a place of memory and quiet honor. Jacob arrived first, walking slowly with his stiff hip. Moses came next, strong and silent, his sharp mind hidden behind a mask of simplicity. Sarah arrived last, moving soundlessly through the trees. The four of them stood together as the forest slowly began to wake, birds calling softly as dawn approached. Punctuation canopy. Small creatures stirred quietly in the brush nearby. The sky was slowly shifting from deep black to dark purple, even though sunrise was still about 20 minutes away. Ruth was the first to speak, her voice kept soft. Even though there was no chance anyone could hear them out here, the boy was still alive. Against every medical rule, against all common sense, Thomas had survived the night. His condition had become steady. With continued care, he would likely heal enough to walk again within a week. But healing meant being sent back to the fields. It meant returning to 14-hour days under the harsh Mississippi sun. It meant growing up to become a man who, old, spent his whole life in chains, who would see his own children born into slavery, who would die as property of the Hartwig family unless they acted now. Ruth explained her idea slowly and carefully. Hartwig believed Thomas was already dead or dying. The overseer had given clear orders that the boy was to receive no help and no treatment. As far as Hartwig was concerned, the matter was finished. A troublesome slave had been removed by natural causes, without costing the plantation anything. But what if Hartwig continued to believe that? What if Thomas officially died, in public, for everyone to see? What if they held a funeral, buried a coffin, and made it real in every way that mattered? And what if, during the sorrow and confusion of a child's death, the living boy quietly disappeared into the night and headed north toward freedom? The silence afterward felt thick and heavy. Everyone understood at once what Ruth was suggesting. They also understood the danger. If they were covered, if the lie came out, if even one thing went wrong, they would all be killed. Not whipped, not sold away, killed. Hung from the same trees that stood around them now, used as warnings to frighten the others into obedience. Jacob was the first to respond, his voice rough with age and feeling. He asked if Ruth truly understood what she was asking, not only of herself but of everyone there, not just the risk to their own lives, but to the lives of everyone they loved. If the plan failed, the Hartwigs would not stop with a few people. They would punish everyone. Every enslaved person on Meadowbrook Plantation would suffer because of this lie. Ruth looked straight at him and did not look away. She said she understood. She had spent the entire night thinking of nothing else. She had measured the danger against what could be gained. She thought about her son Daniel, sold away 6 years earlier, whom she would never see again. She thought about the many children she had watched die on this land over the years. She thought about what it meant to hold even a small piece of power, the kind that came from healing knowledge and a bold idea, and she decided that some risks were worth taking. Moses asked the practical questions. How would they make it believable? Where would the coffin come from? Who would dig the grave? How would they make sure Thomas could escape once he was declared dead? Which path would he take and where would he go? Ruth had already thought through every detail. Moses would build the coffin. He was the finest carpenter among them, skilled enough that the plantation sometimes rented his labor out to white families nearby. He knew where to find leftover wood that would not be missed. He could make a small coffin in just a few hours, plain but convincing. Jacob would oversee the digging of the grave. The slave cemetery sat in the far corner of the plantation, a thin patch of land where nothing grew well. White people never went there. It would be easy to dig a grave and make it look real. Sarah would spread the word of the child's death among the others. She would tell them a boy had died, and that a funeral would take place that evening. She would urge them to come, to sing, to cry. The more people who saw it, the more real it would become. Ruth would take care of everything else. She would secretly continue treating Thomas until he was strong enough to travel. She would gather food and supplies. She would plan the route and explain it to him carefully, making sure he knew where to go and how to survive. Sarah then asked the question everyone had been holding inside. Where could a 10-year-old boy really go? How far could he get? Even if they succeeded in faking his death and getting him off the plantation, what were his true chances of reaching freedom? Ruth said she had thought about that as well. Over the years she had heard whispered stories of slaves who had escaped and made it north. There were routes, hidden paths through forests and swamps. There were people who helped, both black and white, though trust was dangerous. There were towns in free states where runaways could hide and start again. The closest free state was Illinois, about 200 miles north. The town of Cairo sat at the southern edge of Illinois where the Ohio River met the Mississippi. Ruth had heard of Cairo from a traveling preacher who passed through 2 years earlier. The preacher, once enslaved himself, spoke of black communities there that helped fugitives. If Thomas could reach Cairo, he would have a chance. 200 miles. A strong adult moving fast might make it in 2 weeks. A 10-year-old boy healing from a snakebite might need a month or longer. The journey would be dangerous in ways they could imagine and in ways they could not, but it was a chance, the only chance Thomas would ever get. Moses pointed out that they were deciding this for the boy without asking him. Thomas was only 10, still very young. Did he truly understand what running away meant? The fear, the loneliness, the risk of being caught and returned to slavery, or worse. Ruth agreed that this was true. But she said Thomas had never been given a choice about anything else in his life. He had not chosen to be born enslaved. He had not chosen to work in the fields. He had not chosen to be bitten by a snake and left to die. At least now they could offer him one choice about his future, even if it came wrapped in terrible danger. Jacob made his decision next. He said he had maybe 5 years left, if luck was kind, maybe less. His body was worn down after 60 years of hard labor. His eyesight was fading. His joints hurt all the time. His back was covered in scars from years of whippings. He had little left to lose and everything to gain from one final act of resistance before death. He agreed. Moses took longer. He had a wife and 3 living children. If he were caught and killed, they would suffer greatly. They could be sold apart to different plantations, never to see each other again. But Moses also knew that doing nothing was another kind of death, a death of the spirit, a slow killing of hope. He looked at Sarah and saw his daughter's face. He looked at Jacob and saw his own future. He agreed as well. Sarah's choice was the hardest of all. She had lost her youngest child 5 years earlier, a little girl named Mary, only 7 years old. Mary had been bitten by a snake while picking cotton and died screaming within hours because no one helped her. That day never left Sarah's mind. She saw Mary's face in her dreams and heard her cries during quiet moments. Thomas was not Mary. Saving Thomas would not bring Mary back. But maybe it would mean something. Maybe it would be a small piece of justice in a cruel world. Maybe it would prove that not every child had to die in the fields of Meadowbrook Plantation. Sarah agreed. As the sun rose, they went their separate ways, each returning to assigned work before they. Absence could be noticed. They had about 12 hours. 12 hours to build a coffin, dig a grave, gather supplies, and prepare a child for the most dangerous journey of his life. Moses went straight to the old tobacco barn on the east side of the plantation. The barn had not been used for years. Tobacco no longer made money in the area, and the Hartwicks had switched to cotton. Still, the barn stood, slowly falling apart, filled with broken tools and scrap wood. Moses had built coffins before. Death was common enough that the plantation needed a steady supply of simple boxes. The Hartwicks never paid for anything fancy. They gave rough pine boards and expected the slaves to build coffins themselves. This one needed to be small, sized for a child. Moses chose the boards carefully, picking pieces that looked old and worn but were still strong. The coffin did not need to last forever, only long enough to be placed in the ground and covered with dirt. He worked fast and quietly, using hand tools that made less noise than a saw. The barn was far enough away that no one would hear the occasional hammer strike, but Moses stayed cautious. He had learned that slaves who drew attention, even while doing approved work, often paid for it later. The coffin came together in about 3 hours. It was plain, 6 boards nailed into a simple box with a lid. No cloth lining, no decoration, no handles. Exactly what anyone would expect for a dead slave child. Moses made it roughly 3 feet long and 14 inches wide, small enough to look right for a 10-year-old boy. When he finished, Moses stepped back and studied it. He had built many coffins in his life, one for his father, one for his infant son who died of fever, one for his mother. Each coffin had always meant the same thing, the end, the final closing of a life. But this one was different. This coffin stood for hope. It stood for life instead of death, freedom instead of chains. Moses ran his hand over the rough pine and, just for a moment, allowed himself to believe that this dangerous plan might actually succeed. Meanwhile, Jacob, he made his way to the slave cemetery with 2 young men he trusted. William and Peter were both in their early 20s, strong, healthy, and still fairly new to the plantation. They had been bought at auction about 8 months earlier and had not yet been fully crushed by the system. Some spark still lived inside them. Jacob told them they needed to dig a grave for Sarah's grandchild. The baby had been born too early and was stillborn, surviving only a few minutes. It was a story that made sense. Infant death among enslaved people was close to 30% in the antebellum South. Stillbirths and babies dying shortly after birth were sadly common. William and Peter accepted the explanation without hesitation. They were thankful for a break from field labor, even if only for a short while. Digging a grave was exhausting work, but it was different from endless rows. Crops. And that difference made it feel almost bearable. The slave cemetery sat on an empty stretch of land about a quarter-mile from the main quarters. The ground there was rocky and poor, packed with clay that baked hard under summer heat and turned thick and sticky in winter. Very little could grow in that soil besides weeds and rough brush. The graves were marked with plain wooden crosses or sometimes only small piles of stones. Most had no names at all. The dead lived on only in memory, not in carved markers. Jacob told the young men to dig near the edge of the cemetery, beneath a thin, scraggly oak tree that offered a little shade. The grave needed to be about 4 feet deep and 3 feet long, deep enough to look real, but shallow enough that it would not take all day. The earth was hard and uncooperative. William and Peter took turns using the shovel, one digging while the other rested. Sweat ran down their faces and soaked through their shirts. As the sun climbed higher, heat rose into the 90s. What would have taken 30 minutes in good soil took them nearly 3 hours here. While they worked, Jacob carved a simple wooden cross from a fallen branch. He used his pocket knife to peel away the bark and shape the wood. Into the crosspiece he carved a single word, Thomas. Just the name, no dates. Most enslaved children had no recorded birthdays anyway. They were born, they lived, and they died. In the plantation records, they were listed as property gained or lost, not as people with stories and pasts. When the grave was finished, Jacob examined it closely. It looked right. It looked like every other grave in that neglected place. He thanked William and Peter and sent them back to the fields. They left without suspicion, unaware that they had helped prepare a vital part of an escape plan. Sarah spent the day moving through the slave quarters, quietly spreading word of the funeral. She told the same story again and again, changing small details but keeping the core the same. A child had died. A snake bite. Left in the field. Gone by morning. The funeral would be held at sunset. Everyone should come to show respect. The news traveled fast. By midday, everyone on Meadowbrook Plantation knew that a child named Thomas had died in the fields. The details shifted with each telling, as stories often do, but the main facts stayed the same. The slaves accepted the news with tired acceptance born from too much loss. They felt sadness, but not surprise. Snake bites happened. Children died. Life went on. Some of the older slaves remembered Thomas. He was quiet, small for his age, but a hard worker despite his size. His mother had died 3 years earlier from pneumonia. He had no close family left on the plantation. In many ways, he had been alone long before the snakebite. No one questioned why his body had not been brought back to the quarters. No one wondered why the burial was happening so quickly, less than 2 days after his death. Issei things depended on circumstances. In summer, bodies were often buried fast because of the heat. Sometimes there was no time for proper rituals or long mourning. The enslaved had learned to accept whatever small bits of dignity they were allowed. Ruth carried out her usual duties all day, cooking for the Hartwig family, cleaning, serving. But every free moment she found, she prepared for Thomas's escape. She slipped small amounts of food into her apron. A piece of cornbread, some dried pork, 3 apples taken from the root cellar, a small cloth pouch filled with pecans, not enough to be noticed missing, but enough to feed a child for several days. She filled a small earthen jug with water and hid it under her bed. She gathered bandages and mixed more of the healing salve for Thomas's leg. She found an old coat that had once belonged to one of the Hartwick boys, long outgrown and thrown aside. It was far too big for Thomas, but it would keep him warm at night. The most important came from Moses. Early in the afternoon, as Ruth passed by where Moses was repairing a fence, he slipped something into her hand without looking at her or stopping his work. Ruth closed her fingers around it and kept walking. Later, alone in her cabin, she examined it. It was a compass, small and worn but still usable. The brass case was scratched and dented. A crack ran across the glass, but the needle moved freely and pointed north. Moses had inherited the compass from his father, who had taken it from a dead Union soldier during the War of 1812. His father had been forced to serve as a camp servant to his master, an officer. After a battle, he found the compass beside a young soldier's body. He kept it hidden for 40 years, a small object that meant direction and freedom. On his deathbed, he gave it to Moses and made him promise to use it for something important. This was that moment. Ruth also needed a map. She could not draw one herself, since she had never traveled beyond Bite.Then plantation, but Moses had an incredible memory and had listened to travelers talk about the land for years. That evening, after the funeral had been announced but before it took place, Moses drew a rough map from memory on a piece of paper Ruth had stolen from Hartwick's office. The map showed the general northward direction from Meadowbrook Plantation. It marked Coos Creek, about 5 miles north. It showed the Mississippi River roughly 80 miles west. It marked the Arkansas border, then Missouri, and finally Illinois. It was not exact or perfectly scaled, but it was enough to guide Thomas in the right direction. Moses also added a landmark Thomas would need to find on his first night. A large oak tree struck by lightning on the bank of Coos Creek, about 7 miles from the plantation. The tree was huge and unmistakable, half of it blackened and dead from the strike years earlier. If Thomas found that tree, he would know he was heading the right way. As the day passed, Thomas stayed hidden in the cotton field where Ruth had first treated him. She checked on him 3 times, each visit carefully planned so she would not draw attention. Every time she returned, he seemed stronger. By midday, he was awake and whispering. By afternoon, he could sit up with help. His leg was badly injured and painful, but the worst was over. He would survive. During her afternoon visit, Ruth explained everything in quiet, hurried whispers. She told him about the fake funeral, the escape, and the long journey ahead. She watched his face as she spoke, seeing fear there, but also something else. Hope, a desperate wish to believe freedom could be real. Thomas asked only one question. Why were they doing this for him? He was no one, just another enslaved child. Why risk so much for someone who did not matter? Ruth answered without hesitation. Every child mattered, every life mattered. She was tired of watching children die when she had the power to save them. She gave Thomas the Emming tea, then the mixture of herbs that would slow his breathing and make him appear dead. She explained carefully that he must drink it just before the funeral, that it would make him seem lifeless for several hours, and that he must not fight it, even though it would feel terrifying. Thomas nodded. At 10 years old, he already knew that survival sometimes meant trusting those who wanted to help, even when the plan was hard to understand. As the sun began to set, slaves started walking toward the cemetery in small groups. Some sang quiet hymns about crossing the Jordan and going home. Others walked in silence, their faces showing grief that was both real and expected. The white workers paid little attention. Slave funerals were common, and as long as work continued and no trouble followed, grief was allowed. Hartwick arrived on horseback as the sun touched the horizon. He stayed apart, watching with folded arms. His presence was expected, but unwanted. Owners often attended slave funerals not out of care, but to remind everyone who held power. Even in death, the enslaved was still property. The coffin rested beside the grave. Moses and Jacob had carried it earlier from the tobacco barn, pretending it was heavy even though it was empty and light. They had wrapped it in old canvas, making it look proper and hiding the truth inside. Around 40 slaves stood in a loose circle around the grave. The evening air was thick and unmoving. Mosquitoes hummed in the heat. The shadows lay heavy. The scent of the nearby cotton fields blended with the deep, earthy smell of freshly turned ground. Sarah opened the service with a prayer. Her voice was steady and clear, spreading across the cemetery. She prayed for the soul of Thomas, taken far too young from this hard world. She prayed for mercy and for justice. She prayed for the day when all of God's children would finally be free. The other slaves whispered, "Amen," at the right moments. Some cried without hiding it, the sorrow as real, even though they knew Thomas still lived. They were grieving for all the children who had died, for every loss they had suffered, for the cruel system that placed so little worth on young lives. Then they sang, "First swing low, sweet chariot, then wade in the water, and then follow the drinking gourd." The songs were spirituals with hidden meanings. On the surface, they spoke of heaven and salvation. But beneath that, they spoke of escape, of the Underground Railroad, of the North Star that led runaways toward freedom. Hartwick heard only church songs. The slaves heard much more. When the singing stopped, Hartwick rode forward. He looked down at the gathered slaves from his horse, his face unreadable. Then he spoke, his voice loud enough for all to hear. His words were short and cold. The death, he said, could not have been prevented. The boy should have been more careful, should have watched his step. It was a lesson for all of them to stay alert, to do their work correct. To avoid trouble or extra costs for the plantation. The slaves stared at him in silence. Inside, many of them were shouting. This man had allowed a child to die through clear neglect, and now he blamed the child for his own death. The cruelty of it took their breath away, even by plantation standards. Still, they kept their faces calm, their looks properly sad. They had learned long ago that showing anger to white folks only led to more pain, so they swallowed their fury and their grief and stood quietly. Ruth felt something snap inside her chest as she listened to Hartwick speak. Not her determination, which stayed firm, but something else, the last small piece of hope that white people might be capable of simple human kindness. That hope died in that instant, replaced by a hard, cold resolve. Hartwick ended his short speech and rode away without another glance. He had other matters to handle. A dead slave child was not worth more of his time. After he left, Moses and Jacob lifted the empty coffin and slowly lowered it into the grave with ropes. The slaves watched as it sank into the ground. Several women cried out, their voices rising and falling in the old African mourning style their grandmothers had carried across the sea. Then they began to fill the grave. Each slave stepped forward and tossed a handful of dirt onto the coffin. The soil made dull, hollow sounds as it struck the wood. Bit by bit, the coffin vanished beneath layers of Mississippi clay. When the grave was filled, Jacob placed the wooden cross at the head. It read, Thomas, only the name, nothing more. Another unnamed slave child returned to the earth. The funeral ended as night settled in. The slaves walked back to their quarters in small groups, still singing softly. They would eat their evening food, then sleep, then rise before dawn to start another day of work. Life on the plantation went on just as it always had. But 4 people did not sleep that night. Ruth, Moses, Jacob, and Sarah waited inside their cabins, listening to the plantation grow quiet. They waited until the last lamp in the big house went dark. They waited until Jenkins' drunken snoring echoed from his cabin. They waited until only crickets and the distant call of an owl could be heard. Then they moved.